Hi, everybody. Welcome to the next edition of Five Questions with Anthony. I'm very honored to have our very own Lindsay Patterson here with us today. Lindsay is the Executive Vice President of Membership, Marketing, and Communications for IIA. Lindsay is a certified internal auditor and also a certified public accountant. Lindsay, as you know, recently the World Economic Forum has issued a report on risk, a report that's been put together by many subject matter experts in various fields around the world. It's been compiled, analyzed, and they released this report showing what they think the risks are, both short and long term, to the world, to the planet. And we also have our own risk and focus report, which is done obviously through CAEs and other senior members of audit teams, from their perspective, looking at an organization, what they're prioritizing as risk. So what today's purpose is to kind of analyze what's similar, what's different, and how much overlap we have, and what new things our members might need to take away from these two reports. So with that, let me get right into it, and welcome again to this episode.
Thank you so much for having me.
Were there any particular findings in the World Economic Forum risk report that stood out to you or surprised you, just in general?
I wouldn't say any surprised me, but something that certainly stood out was the bleakness of the report. There's much more focus on some of the negative impacts of societal changes, on environmental changes, and how those things are impacting society at large, as well as businesses, organizations, governments, even individuals. That's something that you're not going to see in our risk and focus report for obvious reasons. And while you expect some of this in a risk report, right? It's not the rainbows and butterflies report. You're going to expect some negativity. It was really stark to me to see how respondents to the World Economic Forum's survey came back and are anticipating, a pessimistic outlook, not just for the next 2 years, but getting considerably worse over the next 10 years. So that was something that was a little bit different for me comparing to our own report.
Yeah, and one of the more obvious takeaways you just mentioned is their report was a lot of doom and gloom, including a clear recognition of what they determined or called a deteriorating global outlook. While our risk and focus report didn't offer the type of editorial analysis that the World Economic Forum report does provide, what are your impressions of the global outlook and what might internal auditors need to keep an eye on in the year ahead based on that report?
Yeah, so the report, if you haven't seen it, it looks at 2 years from now and 10 years from now. And some of the items listed on the 2-year report, the more short term, I think are things that are going to be very familiar to our members and to internal auditors in general. When you think about things like inflation or an economic downturn, those things are risks that we're comfortable with, that we talk a lot about as a profession. What's a little bit different in the report that we see from the World Economic Forum is the focus on societal issues and on environmental issues and the long-term impacts that these things might have on organizations. And I think a good example of that would be extreme weather. This is something that the World Economic Forum's report talks about in detail. And you can see this happening as an example here in North America. So in North America, recently, last year and this year, we've seen significant flooding in California, for example. So if my organization is a restaurant chain and we specialize in salads, seeing that the last 2 years in a row, the area where I'm sourcing my lettuce from, as an example, is getting as much rain in 2 days as they normally do an entire year, I'm going to start looking at that as a business and saying, well, how might I diversify, my resources, my vendors? And these are some of the long-term implications that it's good to take a look at the World Economic Forum's risks and to consider those for your organization. I think it does a really good job of calling out everything from environmental risks to technology risks, societal risks, political risks in a little bit more detail.
Lindsay, on the risk and focus report that was issued by IIA last year, the top three risks were cybersecurity, human capital, and business continuity. And of those three, only cyber appeared on the World Economic Forum's list of top risks, though you could certainly say that the World Economic Forum risks like inflation, economic downturn, and lack of economic opportunity would contribute to human capital and business continuity issues. So although they're not specifically called out in the World Economic Forum report, I do think you see those considerations represented just in a slightly different way. What do you make of the top risks in the World Economic Forum report versus our risk and focus report's findings?
Well, I think you hit the nail on the head when you said they're just categorized differently. But if you were to dive into both reports and read what they're really looking at, you see that we're covering a lot of the same information in those two areas. And for me, the takeaway there is World Economic Forum is saying it, IIA is saying it, we're both including it in our risk reports. These are things that organizations of all sizes, all maturity levels, all industries need to be taking quite seriously, considering the specific ways that these three risks might impact your organization, looking at how your organization would respond, how prepared you are right now. And fortunately for our members, we have a lot of resources around this. We have, for example, the Cybersecurity Resource Center. This fall, we have a virtual conference just related to cybersecurity. We have certificates and training related to all of these topics. So if this is something that you and your organization are not looking at, you absolutely need to start doing so. But please lean on us as an organization to help you have those conversations with your teams, with your audit committees.
Agreed. So one area where the two reports agreed was technology being an issue overall, specifically, cybersecurity and AI. And there's no question that those two issues are top of mind to a lot of our CAEs and to the profession as a whole and generally business as a whole. What do you think internal auditors need to be thinking about when it comes to those two risks, cyber and AI, where the two reports agree on the risk levels?
I think the profession has done a really great job of getting its hands around cybersecurity and that risk and being involved in the discourse, leading the conversations. But AI is still new for everyone, including our profession. And when we're talking to our members, to CAEs, this is something that tech companies, larger organizations are much more involved in and looking at, but organizations of all sizes need to be considering the impacts of things like artificial intelligence and specifically the interconnectedness of these two things, artificial intelligence and cybersecurity. And I think that this was very relevant this week with a cybersecurity attack that happened in Hong Kong. I don't know if you've seen this, Anthony, but a multinational corporation in Hong Kong was the victim of a $26 million fraud. And the way this happened was wild. We had a single staff member targeted. So it was typical or similar to a spear phishing attack, right, via email. But it really went to the next level in that these bad actors set up a video conference call, just like you and I are doing right now. This staff member thought that he was talking to his CFO and to his colleagues. He was not. This was artificial intelligence. He thought he was talking to a person who was not there. They followed up by emailing him, sending him messages, and then had a second video conference call with this unfortunate employee who was convinced that he had been authorized to send $26 million in assets to this bad actor, which is ultimately what happened. And when you're seeing that level of sophistication in these sorts of attacks, you've really got to be aware of the capabilities that already exist. So I would say that's number one. Number two is, I just talked about $26 million in assets being lost, but there are also a lot of opportunities here. So consider how your organization might benefit from the adoption of some AI, but just make sure that you're training your staff up. Make sure that you have the proper controls in place. Make sure as an internal auditor that you have a seat at the table from the very beginning, that when your organization is starting to look at how they might adopt AI, that you are part of those conversations from day one. And then my third thing, once again, we've got resources here for you in both cybersecurity. As I mentioned, we recently launched in December our AI Knowledge Center. We have use cases on there. We have a plethora of podcasts, articles. We have our new AI framework. So I just encourage everybody to check those out because we recognize that this is a brand new topic and we want to make sure that you have the tools and resources necessary to help guide you in the conversations.
Thank you very much. That is scary on the CFO. That's unbelievable, and not being able to even tell it apart. Last question for you. So I'm gonna have to look at my notes for this one. Looking 10 years out, the World Economic Forum's top risks are all related to the environment. And one of the interesting data points from this year's report is the shift in climate-related risks, because it's the first time the World Economic Forum isn't calling out climate change as its own risk. It's assuming it's already happened. And it's an underlying factor contributing to other risks. So they've made an assumption that it's happening. And those risks include resource shortages, biodiversity loss, extreme weather events, and a lot more. So we see a lot of movement in the ESG space around the world, particularly in Europe, where it's been for many years. What do you think this ESG and climate trend might mean for our profession in the next few years?
In North America in particular, as you very well know, environmental risks are highly politicized. And what this translates into for organizations is how these conversations take place. And you see this even reflected in our own risk and focus report, where organizations in Europe are more than twice as likely than organizations in North America to identify climate change as one of their top 5 risks. But as you mentioned, all these environmental risks are interconnected, and they are going to result in other risks coming up, like supply chain shortages, human capital as well. And I think as the environmental risks more broadly start to materialize for organizations, you're going to see a shift, particularly in North America, in how these conversations are held. As organizations start to see the financial impact of climate change, of environmental challenges, they're going to be having these conversations more and more. You're going to see the conversations happening more at the board level, at audit committees, and you're going to see it pop up in audit plans more frequently.
Yeah. Who knows how it's going to turn out in the coming years. You're right, a lot of political issues in the United States, probably around the world and other areas as well. Thank you very much, Lindsay. I appreciate it. That's 5 questions. I appreciate your time and your research. Thank you very much. Until next time.